the patient journey in relation to healthcare, from prevention, early detection, diagnosis, treatment options, and ongoing monitoring. There are applications of the use of that DNA across that full cycle. Now, the ultimate goal, I think, if you look back at the Emirati Genome Program, and the DOH are really the champions, they're the owners of this. They're the ones who initiated and instigated the program. M42 have been instrumental in helping deliver it, generate the data, capture the DNA. We're the entity that reached out to the community, secured the consent, collected the sample, sequenced it in our facility, then generated the insight that can be used for those kind of applications. What you have the opportunity to do is deliver that clinical value. And there are specific things that we're already starting to roll out in the UA around things like pharmacogenetics. We can get a profile of you as an individual based on your genetic profile to give an indication of where you would be maybe over-metabolizing or under-metabolizing a drug. So you'd be overly responsive or under-responsive to a certain dose of a certain drug. So you can start to tailor the medication to suit your individual profile in terms of how you would metabolize it. That's one useful application of the use of genomics across that value chain that I indicated earlier.
Welcome to Health Beats. We are one of the world's leading international healthcare podcasts, brought to you by Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week. My name is Steve Gardner. I am the Managing Director of Healthcare World magazine, and we are here this week at Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week itself. There's all sorts of fun games and excitement going on just outside the studio here, but the real action is right here in the studio. And if you can't be at Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week, this is the next best thing. So make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, because there's so much great content that we've been creating for you over this week and in the lead up. And no better than the conversation we're about to have. So I'm joined by Paul Jones, who is Managing Director of Biopharma Solutions at M42. And we're going to find out what that means, aren't we, Paul? How are you doing?
Hackett, doing very well.
How have you found the week?
Awesome. Absolutely incredible. There's a real positive vibe here. The sky's the limit, and it's just it's a lovely place to be.
It is fantastic, and I'm sure we'll get into this over the kind of course of the conversation. All of it seems to be driven by this massive sense of adventure and ambition that kind of drips down from the Department of Health through to you guys as the major provider organisations in the region, through to pretty much every delegate out on that floor, doesn't it?
It's definitely the big vision. But there's also, I think adventure is a really good word, adventurous spirit in making it happen.
And actually, that's kind of a neat kind of segue into the conversation we're going to have, because what you're involved in, and indeed what you've been doing your whole career, has been one hell of an adventure, hasn't it? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey, your story, what kind of brought you to where you are today?
Of course, Steve. Yeah, no, I started 35 years ago
When you were 12.
In big pharma. I worked for the likes of AstraZeneca before they were even the merged company. I was at a company that became part of Sanofi. I was with Novartis in Basel for the first decade of my career. It was really around big pharma. I then moved into big tech at the interface into big pharma for the second decade of my career. Fascinating journey with Cisco as part of quite a unique team that we call the Internet Business Solutions Group, IBSG, back in the day when Cisco were one of the most highly valued companies in the world, and just sharing the experience of how they ran their organization with other customers, clients, board-to-board exchanges that we ran, a fascinating insight into how board collaboration can drive change and innovation at the very highest levels in an industry that, in my case, was focused around life sciences. The last decade has really been focused on the agenda that I think we're going to go in deep in today around these large-scale genome programs. So I was privileged to be involved in the early days on the exec team at Genomics England as the CEO of the interface into industry as part of that business in the early days of Genomics England. It's actually over a decade ago now since I first started there. I jumped from there into one of our big strategic partnerships was with Illumina, and I led what we call population genomics business with Illumina. Initially in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which is where I spend a lot of time in this part of the world. But then I took on the global brief when my boss moved on within the business. And then a couple of years in liquid biopsy, which is an interesting innovation in this space that, again, is woven into these large-scale programs. Took me up until 10 months ago when I joined here as the CEO, initially of the Omics agenda, building on the wonderful work that's been done over the last 4 or 5 years around the Emirati Genome Program, which I'd love to go into more depth around. And my role has evolved into one now that kind of plays back to my experiences over the last 35 years at the interface into pharma and biotech. And we've developed a specific strategy around that engagement with big pharma, looking at biotech as an opportunity. But there's an aspiration. I come back to this idea of visionary thinking here. There is a desire locally within Abu Dhabi to capitalize, to harness, to catalyze from an M42 perspective, this ecosystem build around life sciences. So we want to be a key part of this new ecosystem in life sciences that's been driven in this part of the world.
So can we take you back to the beginning of this, particularly the omics journey? When did you first encounter the idea of large-scale sequencing of human genomes, and when did you first realize its potential?
I was at Cisco probably 15 years ago, engaging around what in those days were not even formal programs at large scale. I've been really interested always in this idea of innovation and how you can use innovation to drive really large scale change. And genomics is an example of a technology that you can describe in, let me be specific, whole genome sequencing. So you're mapping every nucleotide in the DNA sequence of a human being in the particular focus that I have is a wonderful opportunity, an example of an innovation that in the past was steeped in research. It's a classic research endeavor, but has the potential to be translated in something that will have clinical impact, it can make a difference for patients. And when you look at that implications for patients, you can start to see how that could fundamentally transform health systems. And so I can't think of anything bigger in terms of the impact on a country than transforming its health system. Genomics is an example of a technology that's evolved from research. I was involved in the early days at Genomics England in helping translate that into something that a health system would start to adopt as part of its standard of care. And so it's almost think of it as a research project where the goal is, if there's enough evidence that's generated at the end of it, a clinical system that has to have proven evidence before it will adopt something will say that's sufficient for us to accept that as being made available across the whole of the country in the UK back in the day. And so a wonderful example of translating innovation into having a large-scale impact. So that's really my area of interest.
So for those people who don't have the kind of knowledge and experience, and some of our audience will, some of them won't, let's just get the very basics out of the way.
Sure.
What is a genome and how do you sequence it?
So genome is basically the code of life. And we all have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and on there sits the DNA that we actually sequence. The way that we actually go about it is we reach out to the community. Let's talk specifically about the Emirati Genome Program. The goal 4 years ago was to sequence, to map, to capture the DNA and to sequence it to get the insight that we'll start to be able to use for a whole range of different purposes, and I'll come back to that in a second, to capture that from a blood sample, to centralize the process of sequencing it, and then making it available to different audiences who could use it for different purposes. In some cases, to deliver individual impact back to you as an individual that donated your DNA. More from a pharma perspective, they're not interested initially in the in identifiable data that's associated with you. They're interested in the aggregate data that they may be able to use to develop precision medicines for groups of people like you. But ultimately, and this is a really interesting, that is that connection between the personalization, the individual DNA that is relevant for you and what implications it might have for you as an individual, and the link across to a de-identified version of that grouped with a whole bunch of other people who have also had their DNA sequence that could be used to get an insight for an industry like pharma and biotech that are trying to develop precision medicines for groups of patients like you, where that precision medicine would work more effectively in you than it would in other people. So the principle, the vision, if you like, of personalization of medicine, which is effectively what we're enabling through this DNA sequencing.
And it's got more applications than just pharma and biotech, hasn't it? You can use this for a whole bunch of different purposes, from using large quantities of genomic data to understand predilections for particular disease, designing therapeutics that can be used for preventative purposes, using it for clinical trials. What are the limits of it? What are the different...
Let me try and simplify it in saying, look, I think my view is the ultimate goal is to deliver clinical value. To you as an individual patient would see benefit from donating your DNA, and you would be able to use it to anticipate future risks, to start to personalize medicines, to to get a diagnosis. In fact, let's plot out the path that it might offer value. You could get an insight into those aspects of you as an individual made up from your DNA that could anticipate future risks. So prevention as a theme and early detection could be a very useful application of your DNA. If you suffered from a rare disease, you could use the DNA to get an insight into confirming the diagnosis. If you were a cancer sufferer, you could use the DNA to get an indication of how you might tailor treatments that could be suited to the specific DNA profile of your personal DNA profile of what was maybe causing the cancer. You can also use the DNA to monitor, let's say you've been treated for cancer, but there's a risk that it might recur. You can use the DNA that may be captured from your blood, the liquid biopsy opportunity, to get an insight into the possible recurrence at a very early stage so that you can jump in early and start to treat it. So if you look across the breadth of the patient journey in relation to healthcare, from prevention, early detection, diagnosis, treatment options, and ongoing monitoring, there are applications of the use of that DNA across that full cycle. Now, the ultimate goal, I think, if you look back at the mRNA genome program, and the DOH are really the champions, they're the owners of this. They're the ones who initiated and instigated the program. M42 have been instrumental in helping deliver it, generate the data, capture the DNA. We were the entity that reached out to the community, secured the consent, collected the sample, sequenced it in our facility, then generated the insight that can be used for those kind of applications. What you have the opportunity to do is deliver that clinical value. And there are specific things that we're already starting to roll out in the UA around things like pharmacogenetics. And so we can get a profile of you as an individual based on your genetic profile to give an indication of where you would be maybe over-metabolizing or under-metabolizing a drug. So you'll be overly responsive or under-responsive to a certain dose of a certain drug. So you can start to tailor the medication to suit your individual profile in terms of how you would metabolize it. That's one useful application of the use of genomics across that value chain that I indicated earlier. There may be others. It's being introduced into the UAE now through premarital screening. That would be another use case where you'll start to look before people get married. You can look at the compatibility and basically support couples who are at risk of that compatibility causing issues with regard to rare disease, where effectively you can give advice and support to those individuals about how that can, the care process that thereafter can be optimized.
I think it's important to point out at this juncture that we're not talking about romantic compatibility here. We're not saying
indeed.
Your genome is going to tell you whether you're going to get
No, indeed.
Although that might be an interesting application in the future. It is fascinating. And I guess from your point of view, you've been very fortunate in terms of the turn of your career. Your activity in this space has kind of reflected the explosion of this particular area. And it is fascinating, isn't it, that this is the nexus of high-powered computing, the development of AI, and the development of genome sequencing as a clinical
application.
It does bring together those three elements, doesn't it? So to actually create.
So as I reflect on my career, this role that I have now is almost, it touches on almost every role I've had over the last 35 years, all rolled into one. But also in terms of the convergence of these different technologies, innovations, and so. And I think I can put it in the context of, if you think about this in terms of the goal of these programs to deliver clinical value, but the challenge is, if you look at this genome that I referenced earlier, we probably understand about 2% of that today that is relevant to be able to say to you, we can use that information to give you advice around pharmacogenomics or premarital screening or other future applications that could give an indication of your future risk for different disorders. 2%. There's still 98% to be discovered. We still don't understand the implications. Now, one of the really important things I'd like to emphasize is we talk about genomics, but effectively it's looking at the genome in relation to the way that some of the symptoms around diseases and disorders might manifest. So collecting clinical data is another aspect of this that's really, really important. There's another M42 business called Malafi that is central to coordinating what's called the health data exchange across Emirati, across the Abu Dhabi community, but more broadly reaching out into the wider Emirati agenda. Health data linked with genomic data, that pattern matching between seeing a mutation in the genome that always seems to link to a clinical symptom, breast cancer, certain monogenic diabetes, as familial hypercholesterolemia, for example, as examples of specific mutations that can cause disorders. When that pattern matching exercise happens, you get an insight and say, that mutation, every time you see it, has this certain phenotype, as it's known, clinical phenotype. That's really important. It's a pattern matching exercise. It's a beautiful example of the potential for AI technology to be woven into that agenda to find future patterns. So when I talk about delivering clinical value, we only understand 2% today. That's what gets implemented in a health system. So the clinicians today sitting at the bedside, advising a patient on, we understand this 2%, let's translate that into value for you. But how do we unlock the 98% that we haven't yet uncovered? Well, that's where the research engagement comes in. So we need to stimulate research engagement around the data set that's been created. That's where I come back to this link between what's delivered to you as an individual is personal, identifiable data delivered through your physician in the appropriate fashion. A de-identified version of that, aggregated together with the wider population, could give an insight into the patterns that might unlock that 98% we don't understand yet. And where did we get access to that insight that might help unpack that? There's a research community within the UAE, Khalifa University, NYU in Abu Dhabi. There are academic institutions that can engage around the data set and start to unpack it. But look more broadly, there's a global community of experts around this genomic phenotype linking that would love to get access to the data that can help us unpack them with more insight. The other aspect to this is globally, there are pharmaceutical biotech companies whose goal in life is to develop therapies that could be of use to you as an individual, but they start by looking at de-identified population level data for looking for those patterns, using AI to support them to expedite that, make that more effective. And effectively, what we're trying to do is create this link between delivering clinical value, stimulating research engagement, whether through academic, local and global, through global industry engagement, pharma and biotech, and then facilitating that translation into maybe recruiting you, if you have a certain genetic profile, into a particular trial that would help substantiate and provide the evidence that says, yes, this mutation can be treated with this medicine that means that you'll be cured of this disease, or it will treat the symptoms of this disease. And that beautiful opportunity where you manage the link between the clinical domain and the research domain is a never-ending loop. We talk about an eternal loop of insight that translates into the clinic that then stimulates further research engagement.
And I think it's important to note the relationship between genomic data and healthcare data. You talked about Malafi and the Malafi relationship with the mRNA genome program, but it goes broader than that, doesn't it? Because we're also looking at general population data. We're looking at social determinants of healthcare. We're looking at financial data. We're looking at all of these different things and the way in which they interoperate. And that's what then provides us with a really high level of insight.
And you make a really important point, Steve. Those data sets are not always linked in, but the question is, could they be? And can they be more efficiently woven in if you integrate AI into this whole agenda that would make that an easier thing to do? But actually, even going further than that, if you think about these eternal loops that we're talking about, clinical value, research value, could there be an underpinning to that we could describe as an economic development agenda? Because if you get this right, and this is what we're trying to do in Abu Dhabi, is that you can use that to stimulate local engagement. You can encourage spin-outs from some of these academic institutions that say there's a business opportunity here in helping interpret the data that might be generated here from the de-identified data set. There are AI companies that would benefit from having access to this data to train their algorithms that would optimize the future development of precision medicines. There are biotech companies that would be interested in relocating to Abu Dhabi to get access to the ecosystem that can facilitate this link, not only to the data set, but that potentially linking to the sample that's stored in another M42 business that's associated with building the Abu Dhabi biobank. But even more importantly, you could argue, is the potential to link to the actual patient themselves, translating from this de-identified research data set into something that might impact you as an individual, where through the right channels, for example, a pharmaceutical company would say, I've found an individual, anonymized from their perspective, that would be ideal for me to recruit into this trial. Have you got a mechanism in the UAE to, through the appropriate clinical channel, for the doctor that is treating you to offer you the chance to be engaged in this trial, to recruit you to that trial? That's a wonderful opportunity. So what we're doing is making the connection between the patient, the sample that was collected from that patient that's stored and that future analysis can be run on, the data that's generated from that sample that offers insights into development of precision medicines, gives you insights into your pharmacogenetic profile, your premarital screen profile. All of that insight comes from, as it were, sequencing that whole genome. We've gone across the breadth, far wider than what we understand to use today, but with this mechanism saying that we do know what to use will translate into value for you, but that we don't will engage in the global research community that can unlock future value over time and ideally accelerate the agenda that gets 2% learning up to 5% to 10%, 20%, and over time you're going to see that number getting smaller, bigger, whichever percentage you're talking about, in terms of more insight offered and more value being unlocked. And the way I think about these programs, these national programs are really complex. They have often government sponsorship, as you saw in here. You're trying to deliver clinical value, so there's a clinical perspective on it. There's a research engagement angle, and there's an industry perspective. Ultimately, all trying to drive at delivering patient value. Each of those stakeholders, government, researcher, clinician, patient, industry, will define value in a different way. If I'm an industry guy, I may be focused on what's the next precision medicine. If I'm a government, I'm saying, well, what's the return for my population? If I'm a clinician, I want to see patient benefit for you as an individual in terms of treating your disease. Each of those measures of value, and there are many more than I've listed there, we need to understand. And then you can start to build a perspective on how you can justify running these large-scale programs. It's almost like the business case that supports why do a population-level sequencing agenda, and driving that agenda, create the business case for it, justify, substantiate it, and effectively start to monitor the impact of that over time in terms of the outcomes that can have an impact on you as an individual, but also can tick off some of the other ways that value is measured from each of the other perspectives.
But if you look at where you are right now, you're in a really interesting place, because you've got a program that's been in place for the last 4 or 5 years. You've reached, as I understand it, the point at which the indigenous population of Abu Dhabi have all had their genome sequenced.
700,000 locals out of roughly a million population. So 70% of the way.
And you're now starting on the expat population.
Also 100,000 in the mix, absolutely.
So you're actually at that point of going, okay, we've got the data, or we've got most of it. We continue to drip feed and add to that data pool. I guess your job at this point of view is, okay, Paul, you've got the data now. What are you going to do with it?
Absolutely. I mean, there was always a view of the so what, why do it? It goes back to that justification point that says, well, value can be measured in different ways. Where you can quantify them, you would, but some of them are qualitative and they're equally valid. So absolutely, so what? Answer that question. Well, the so what is, well, we can deliver patient value. We can transform healthcare. We can shift the emphasis from illness management to wellness management, prevention, early detection, as something that using this as one of the inputs in terms of shifting that emphasis in health and care, as I describe it, to being more health than care. There will still need to be care, but the emphasis goes more towards prevention and early detection. That's a key benefit. Absolutely, that's one of the so whats. But also, as I said, we still don't understand 98% of what's in there. So how can we engage the value that would be associated with the research engagement, industry engagement, to offer more insights, more value over time? Now, we're at the stage now where there are already examples of delivering clinical value into the UAE, pharmacogenomics, premarital screening, looking at monogenic disorders and risk profiling in relation to that. In the future, we'll introduce things like polygenic risk scoring, so looking at where it isn't just a single mutation in the genetic profile, but multiple of them that contribute in aggregate towards a risk profile of different disorders.
Which is that point, isn't it, with that element of the program? This is about the idea of being able to understand, Murad, simply from looking at somebody's genomic code, or genetic code, and comparing it to the anonymized data set. You are at risk of this, and therefore we can now give you an understanding of what you need to do to avoid that condition, that disease.
Or may be able to offer you specific support on a journey that you clearly are going to own anyway. It's how you want to live your life. But if you know that you're at particular high risk, if you continue to eat certain foods, or is there a medication that might help you decrease your risk, it's giving that insight. The choice is still with the individual, but it's helping it become a more informed decision, predicting the risks early, anticipating them, with the implications being that you might actually change where you allocate resources in a health system in the longer term, because you can focus more on supporting that endeavor, keep people healthier, longer health span, rather than what happens in almost without question, almost all health systems of the world. It's focused on this the disease management
So,
side.
so I think it's a great illustration and a personal illustration from this week. I was lucky enough yesterday to share a stage with Dr. Layla
Yes.
from the National Reference Laboratory. A subject that is very close to my heart. My mum died as a result of complications from Alzheimer's disease last year.
Sorry to hear.
And we had a fantastic panel session yesterday with Dr. Layla and with a lady called Dr. Ema McSweeney, who's been involved in the clinical trials for some of the most advanced treatment drugs for Alzheimer's. Got quite emotional now during the panel session.
I can imagine.
And Dr. Layla is taking me over at the Cleveland Clinic tomorrow, and is going to give me exactly that test. So I'm going to get my own genomic test to understand whether I have a predilection for Alzheimer's, and lucky enough that if I have, that I'm going to get on the clinical trial as well. So there you go. That's a really practical and real world example of the kind of thing you're trying to do, isn't it?
Can I give you a specific example,
Yeah,
Steve?
please.
Even in that space with Alzheimer's now. So as part of this endeavor where we're looking to engage biotech and pharma companies, we're working with one particular company, Halia Therapeutics, where they have an Alzheimer's treatment that is in clinical development.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a place where they can run their trials.
Yeah.
And it could be a game changer. Yeah, they spent a number of years researching and discovering the medicine, and maybe we'll have time to go into how they came about discovering, but it's really interesting because it's based on genomic insight with those people who we know have a genetic underpinning that would indicate they're at very high risk of having Alzheimer's, but they don't manifest the symptoms. So they then use that to try and understand, well, how was it that these people who should have Alzheimer's didn't have Alzheimer's? They use that to unpick the human biology, look for markers on the side of the gene that we know is causal, and they've then focused therapeutics around that agenda, which is their medicine that they're bringing to the market, to basically influence the trajectory of the disease.
So what you're saying there is that what they've done is they've said, okay, you have the biomarker that means you should develop. You haven't developed, so therefore, what is there in your genetic code that has stopped the disease from developing, and how do we then simulate that
to replicate that effect if we were going to treat someone who doesn't have that as a naturally occurring thing in their genome?
Yeah.
Now, that's the basis of their medicine.
Yeah. That's an incredible example.
That in itself is really powerful.
Yeah.
So what they're now looking for is people who haven't yet got Alzheimer's, but who would be at risk of Alzheimer's in the future, because the belief is the earlier you can connect with someone, offer them a treatment, the sooner, that you've got more chance of influencing the disease before it's in a mature state.
But it's the development of proteins in the brain, isn't it, that causes Alzheimer's.
So if that's already established,
stopping those proteins from developing.
So as with all diseases, the earlier you could get to it, so hence the shift in emphasis towards prevention and detection, you've got a great increased chance of being able to influence the direction of travel for the disease. In this particular case, there is a certain gene called ApoE4. If you've got those on both strands of your DNA, that would indicate you're at something like 8 to 10 times of the risk of the normal population who don't have that of having Alzheimer's. It's almost, I would say a guarantee, but let's say you've got a 90% chance of having Alzheimer's. Now, in the particular population that they discovered originally, they were finding people who had those and didn't have the disease. The basis of their medication is trying to replicate the equivalent of that in a population doesn't have it. And so the challenge for them is, where do you find the patients who have got the ApoE4 on both? You need to have screened the whole of the population to be able to handpick those individuals.
And again, Dr. Layla talked about this yesterday, the fact that we have the capability and the ability ultimately to potentially eradicate Alzheimer's completely by creating and using that genomic test. Almost like a smear test for when as soon as you reach the age of 45, you have the blood test, you have the sample compared, we give you the treatment, and we can eradicate that.
Potentially stop it happening in the first place.
Which is an unbelievable thing to be able to do.
Unbelievable. And so, but the key point I wanted to make was, in any other country of the world, the way that they find people who are ApoE4 positive on both strands of DNA is that those people have to have been sequenced, and you have to have that insight. They have to turn up to a clinic. A physician has to say, I think you might be at risk here, and therefore, could we look at what we can do to support you? Remember, these are people who probably wouldn't turn up because they are pre-symptomatic. They haven't yet got the symptoms of the disease. So how do you find them?
Yeah.
They came to the UAE. The fact that we've sequenced 70% of the population means that with the right permission, we can look into that anonymized data set and find out the people at the flick of a switch that have ApoE4.
Exactly.
Now, you can't do that until you've screened the whole of a population.
Yeah.
So that is a game changer. If anyone wants an argument that says, why should I do a whole genome sequencing program? It's because you can look in and not wait for that to happen naturally, which would take 100 years.
This is the whole point. I have not had my genome sequenced. I am not having my genome sequenced.
So you don't know if you're ApoE4 positive.
No, exactly.
And that could be a risk factor.
Because of the fact that you have sequenced the entire population, I can rock up tomorrow, have blood taken, and have my genome compared with that to say, yeah, you have actually. Now we can do something about it. That I think as a real world example and as a way of accessing and understanding the reasons and the opportunities that these programs have, it's a fantastic example.
So the way that then moves forward is you get to a point where you say, and this is what's happening. The team have said, well, that's a game changer. Like our medicine can get tested, trialed through a clinical trial in a way that it couldn't anywhere else because we can't find the patients.
Yeah.
And so they are actually relocating the company to the UAE as part of the cluster here, part of the ecosystem. They are working with our clinical research organization, IROS, to implement the trial. So Islam is general manager of IROS, is supporting Halia in implementing their clinical trial. They need to get approval from the DOH to run this because there are some nuances here. Effectively, you're looking to treat people who are very early stage or are asymptomatic for a disorder, but you know are super high risk in the future. So again, you need a flexible, innovative regulator to accommodate giving approval to that to be the case. But what a beautiful example of the benefit of having a genomic insight across the whole of the population to justify why this might make sense for something as critical a disorder as Alzheimer's that ultimately is going to impact, you can see today is impacting the world.
But there's a really interesting question here, and I guess you're in a unique position to answer this question because you worked in the UK's genome.
I did.
Genomics England, as well as, now being involved with the...
Well, I was fortunate when I was at Illumina, I ran what we call global population genomics. So I was fortunate to touch 50 different countries around the world who were looking to initiate their version of the genome program.
How many countries actually have started to sequence genomes at scale?
There are at least 50 who have the intention of doing so. Those that have really started to do it at scale, I would probably, off the top of my head, I'm thinking maybe 10 that would come.
So UAE, UK, who else?
Singapore, Sweden, Ireland had a major initiative. There are examples in the US, the All of Us program, the Million Vets program. Not all of those data sets are publicly available or they're in early stage of being developed, but there are some really high quality programs elsewhere in the world. But the one point I would make in relation to the size of the population, Steve, there is nothing close to 70% of the population being sequenced. No, the UK example, 100,000 genomes on a population of 65 million as a percentage of population.
Exactly. It's not close. A big enough data set to provide you with the level of insight that you require.
In relation to the population. Now, the insight that you get, and this is another interesting point, and I have to kind of give credit here to my friend and colleague running bioinformatics at M42, Tiago. Tiago is always championing this idea that when you've sequenced 70% of the population, what you naturally have is family clusters. And you can start to see diseases flowing through generations, grandparents, parents, children who have the same disorder.
And understanding the nature of hereditary conditions and how they mutate over time.
Well, going back to my point about engaging the research community around the data set, that is incredibly insightful to find signals that transfer across generations in terms of increasing the chance of researchers unlocking the rationale for the human biology behind that link. And so you accelerate the chance of success of translating the research insight into something that could have an impact in the clinic.
What I'm curious about, though, when you're getting to data at that level of detail, when you compare genomic data sets from the UK, the US, Sweden, Middle East, are there cultural differences? Are we, when we talk about precision medicine, are we taking account of the different cultural backgrounds of human beings?
It's a great question. The answer is we are aware of the fact that we aren't. And so the majority of the data that sits in genomic databases that are being accessed by global researchers today are predominantly white, Caucasian, Western European origin. And so what's the other reason I would emphasize the value that comes from something like the Emirati Genome Program is you're introducing a diverse data set into that global mix, which is going to provide some insights into how the profile, the genetic profile and the phenotype that's related to that will have implications for what you want to do when you develop precision medicines that ought to be tailored to those different populations.
And
We're already seeing mutations that you don't see elsewhere in the world, either causing disease or, going back to my previous point, where in other parts of the world there are causal mutations that here don't appear to manifest in a disorder.
Yeah, exactly. And understanding why a particular condition will affect one proportion of the population or one racial or cultural group, and it won't affect another, is a key part of where the science goes here. Also, there is that long-held criticism around clinical trials and pharmaceuticals that, you know, the majority of clinical trials are done on white European people. And therefore, do we necessarily understand how a particular drug will affect a different cultural group?
I have to say, Steve, I think there's been a transformation in the last few years, recognizing that as an issue. You need programs like the Emirati Genome Program to be implemented in order to be added to the mix so that you can start to rebalance that equation.
So the next obvious question, the next obvious step is we spend a lot of time talking about women's health. So actually, does this give us an opportunity to address the balance in terms of the fact that so much of our clinical research, so much of our understanding of human physiology has been based, rather unfortunately, on men?
Yeah. It gives an opportunity to highlight that. It's part of the wider agenda in terms of driving tailored research to suit the nuances either of a population or of a gender. Absolutely. There's no question on that front.
How far can this go? What do you see as the ultimate end point of the work that's going on here? How much could we achieve?
We are at the point, I think, where we're using innovations like genomics, which is just one example of an innovation that is clearly already having an impact on health systems to start to transform the way health systems operate. As we know, the world over, governments are stretched with funding those health budgets. And I think what we're doing is using the example of genomics and innovation in that space to transform and shift the emphasis from illness management to prevention, early detection, wellness management. And I think you're going to start to see that shift over the coming years. Programs like this will substantiate the rationale for that, will justify it through the examples that I hope I've been able to unpack. And I think genomics is just one of the technologies in the mix. What we'll see over time is more technologies being added. You know, the proteomic agenda, the epigenetic insights that give an insight in what turns on genes and turns off genes is another layer of information that gives us more and more insight into the biological underpinnings of disease and wellness and
the human body in general. I mean, how DNA works. How does a strand of DNA know what it's supposed to be growing, what kind of cell it is, which relates back to cancer again, doesn't it?
It links to all sorts of emerging therapeutic modalities, as I would describe it. We're not just talking about small molecule treatments anymore. We've got cell and gene therapies. We've got other types of treatments that will come to the market in the coming years that can help address some of the concerns that are uncovered as a result of this. In some cases, going back in and actually changing the genetic code itself to start to as a treatment in terms of how that might deliver.
Coding out a propensity to cancer or Alzheimer's, whatever it may be. What do you think we might find out in the other 98% of the genome?
I think we're going to see more and more clinical value that will mean that population-level sequencing becomes the norm. Every country around the world, I think, ultimately will engage in this endeavor. The cost, the price associated with doing it will come down because it will be on a larger scale basis. And I think I've worked, as I mentioned, at Illumina. We always used to challenge different countries that we were talking to, which will be the first country in the world to sequence the whole of its genome. And if you do that, what implications will it have on the way you run your health system? We're on the verge of really being able to understand that question because I think the UAE is going to be the country that achieves that goal. Whole of the local population will be sequenced. We're already seeing the transformation of that health system. We're seeing a shift in emphasis from illness management to wellness management. We're seeing individuals understanding how that genomic information can be used to benefit them as individuals but also in a de-identified fashion contribute towards understanding the greater research endeavor. Global pharmaceuticals, biotech companies, emerging modalities will result in better treatments, more cost effectively delivered, that change people's lives. And I think that's effectively what we're at the beginning of unlocking here.
Well, all I know is that I definitely have a genetic predisposition for going overtime on podcasts. That's all we've got time for. I could carry on having this conversation for much, much longer. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Absolutely brilliant conversation. Just one of a whole raft of amazing discussions and content that we've developed this week at Abu Dhabi Global Health Key, and will continue to develop over the months and years to come. And for that reason, if you haven't had your genome sequenced yet, why not? And if you haven't subscribed to Health Beats, why not? You'll find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Please do so as soon as you possibly can. Otherwise, you might miss out on great conversations like this. Thanks. We'll see you next time.